So we are going to learn about the new cookbook, the Blue Zone's American Kitchen, that I've already delved into and found lots of good information. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here today for this interview. We are really hyped about it. And welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay. And, you know, one of the things that our little Chat and Chew study group has done is studied your work since 2014, when you went to Google's Advanced Study Weekend. And we were able to look at that and take that as our first learning experience. And, you know, the thing that you've done that really speaks to people, especially our group, are your stories, where you deliver the messages in wonderful ways. And I thought with this book, there's lots of stories in here that fit nicely, as well as your experience. So here we go. Can you help me with some of the stories? And the first one is the very first sentence in the book. And I'm going to read it directly from the book because it's just so powerful. This book could help you live an extra 10 good years. How do you know that, Dan?
Well, we know that if you're eating the standard American diet, it is shaving 10 years off your life expectancy if you're a 20-year-old male and a female rather, and 13 years off your life expectancy if you're a 20-year-old male. And the diet that this book unpacks is the Blue Zone diet of longevity. I mean, we have found populations that are not dying of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and dementia anywhere near the rates we are. And the majority of the reason they're living so much longer is they're eating a whole food, plant-based diet, as I outlined in this Blue Zone's American Kitchen. A meta-analysis, again, my work isn't causative. I can't say do this and for sure that will happen, but I can say these populations have eaten this way and they've lived a long time. So that's when I make the statement that this book can add 10 years. We know this dietary pattern has occasioned people living in an extra decades in 5 different continents. So we're pretty sure it'll work for you.
Yes, for sure. One thing that I thought you did really well was where you went over what has happened to America. And you had some great charts in there and some research that you pulled together. And so do you mind kind of just reviewing some of that research of tell us the story, what's happened to America that's not like the Blue Zones?
No, and you know, there's no real bad guy. You know, people like to point to corporations or the man and blame big companies for the fact that, you know, we're deluged in processed foods and foods with sugar added in them and fast food restaurants and altogether too much meat. But it really goes back to 1970 when Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, really responding to the fact there was a lot of Americans who weren't getting enough food. We needed more calories in our system. And they created this farm bill, which incentivized farmers for growing rice, corn, wheat, and soy, and sugar cane. And subsidized it heavily and made the distribution system very easy. So all of a sudden, in the next 40 years, the supply of those products have skyrocketed. Well, when you think about it, those 5 products are the inputs for most of the junk food and animal feed in America. So, you know, you take General Mills, and you know they take the wheat and they make cereals that have a lot of sugar in them, and kids like them. And cattle ranchers, they find it's a lot cheaper to just create feedlots and take their cows out of the cow pastures where they're getting eating grass with the high in omega-3 fatty acids, and they put them in these feedlots and they feed them corn and rice, soybeans, and the meat is fattier and there's omega-6 fatty acids, which is inflammatory. So over the past 40 years, the amount of sugar we consume has gone up by about 20%. The amount of high fructose corn syrup has gone up by about 80%. The amount of meat we eat has gone up by about 10%. And grocery stores, 70% of which only have 70% of all foods in grocery stores are highly processed foods. So the thing is, in America, it's very hard to make a healthy choice unless you do so intentionally. And the whole idea behind the Blue Zone American Kitchen was to propose a different standard American diet, as was consumed by these four ethnic groups and immigrants back around the turn of the last century, as a different food pattern, which could resolve a lot of our health issues and resolve a lot of the sicknesses and the $4.2 trillion we're spending every year on unnecessary diseases.
And that chart you had on what has happened to us in the 1900s, I think it showed that there were Americans eating 3,600 calories, and more recently, we're consuming 2,400 calories. So it's more than just the calories, isn't it? It's a lot more.
Right. Well, back in 1900, we were doing about 5 times as more exercise or non-exercise physical activity. So we were burning those calories. And we were eating a lot more whole grains. We were eating a lot more fruits and vegetables, a lot less sugar, a lot less meat. And, now what we're mostly eating is this metabolically damaging food. I would say sugar is probably the number one toxin in the diet that we're eating now that people weren't eating back at the turn of the last century.
Yeah, it's a very different diet, that's for sure. And then comes the best stories of the book, and those are the ones of your journey. I mean, you have to take a journey, and you've taken one across the United States and discovered so you call it uniquely American, but largely overlooked American diet. Can you give us some examples of some of the journeys that you've discovered? Some of those.
Sure. So, the first journey was to NYU because, I work at National Geographic, and everything we do has to be underpinned by scientific studies or facts. And we were looking for verifiable dietary patterns in America that mimic the longevity diet we've seen in blue zones. So we began by digging through about 90 dietary surveys and anthropology studies to identify these ethnicities who were eating mostly a whole food plant-based diet. And by the way, it was not my answers. It wasn't the people from Central and Northern Europe. It was the African Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans living between about 1900 and 1930. And remarkably, it's almost a dead ringer for what people in Sardinia and Okinawa and Ikaria are eating as far as sort of the general category of mostly complex carbohydrates, medium fat. It's not a low fat diet, but very low in animal products.
And one of the things I noticed too was you made a note here that the recipes from those groups that you discovered, they are plant-based. Why did you decide to go with plant-based only?
Because for the Blue Zone brand, I decided to make it plant-based because you can turn off your brain and cook any one of these recipes, and it'll be good for you and be good for your family. So I know people are going to eat, hamburgers and steak and treat themselves with ice cream and candy every once in a while, and that's probably okay. But I made an intentional effort in this book to only work with chefs who were cooking maniacally delicious plant-based food, so that when you crack open this book, you can be sure it's something that's going to contribute to your longevity, but also it's going to taste good. And I brought my father, 87-year-old dad, Roger Buettner, who was grew up on a farm eating meat and potatoes. And he personally tried every one of these recipes. And if he didn't like it, it didn't make the book. So, we're pretty sure that no matter how far you are along the continuum of moving away from the standard American diet, you're going to like the recipes in this book.
I know I did. I immediately latched onto the smoky collards, and that was the one from the African American population, I believe. But there was another one that was really interesting, and you had a lead into this in your text as you visited that area. The Benny seeds, because I'd never tried those before, so I've ordered some, and I'm going to try those with the butter beans.
Yeah. I don't want people to think that this book is full of impossibly exotic ingredients. In every case, I've offered if there's an exotic ingredient, I've offered a more sort of ingredient you can get at your local grocery store. And I tried really hard to make sure the recipes were easy to make. Most of them would take less than a half hour. Most of them, the final dishes cost less rather than $2 a serving. This is really I think the big epiphany in writing these books, the Blue Zone American Kitchen, the Blue Zone Kitchen, is that the foods of longevity are really peasant food, the food that poor people ate. And it was the white flour and the white sugar and the meat and the cheese, rich people food. That's the food that got us in trouble here. And so the thing is, we've lost our ability in America to make these simple peasant foods taste delicious. And much of what this book does is it captures the culinary genius that has evolved in these ethnicities over the course of hundreds of years of trial and error. And I found 55 amazing chefs there who cook these heirloom recipes. And these, in many cases, they're just historians. In some cases, they're cooks who have deep roots in their tradition. And, I actually went and cooked with them. This whole book I created with David McLean from National Geographic. We write for National Geographic. We produce several stories for National Geographic magazine. This cookbook is like a 300-page National Geographic story with phenomenal photography. It could be a coffee table book, science writing. But the reason there's 100 recipes to live to 100 is because I know people like recipes, and I know people like to put ideas to work. And the recipes was the way to put it to work. It never set out to be a cookbook. It's really a work of anthropology, but it serves very well as a cookbook.
Yeah, that was my thought exactly. That's a perfect way to describe it, a book of anthropology, because the introduction stories, it kind of lays out the history of how these foods became so important to that culture and how they made them taste good. Just really exciting. I mean, I was amazed at how much of it was recipes, but the recipes were part of the story. So that was like a bonus. That was great. Were there any particular ones that you thought, oh, this one's going to be mine, or I recommend this one the most? Or
there's people who are living in the Carolinas and Georgia, the Gullah Geechee people, who were descendants of the slaves who particularly were good at rice farming. They made a type of rice called Carolina Gold, which is actually an African strain of rice, which is healthier and I think better tasting than normal Asian-derived rice. But the Gullah Geechee cuisine is a fusion of West African, Native American, and these Gullah Geechee got to know the Native Americans when they were brought to America here, and then of course they're European derived enslavers or masters, whatever you want to call them, and they ingeniously fuse these cultures together and these cuisines together. So there's a chef named B.J. Dennis who actually made a gumbo. Gumbo is actually not a New Orleans word; it's a West African word for okra, and he made this okra stew with tomatoes, onions, carrots, celery, garlic, some olive oil, a little bit of vinegar for acid, these red brown bonnet peppers, which are searingly hot but delicious, these sesame seeds, they call them Benny seeds. You can just use plain sesame seeds, but Benny seeds add a little bit of umami, and and of course okra, and the result is this thick and rich and chunky, delicious stew or soup that is so rich and flavor soup and hot. Actually, you cry tears of joy.
Well, I'm going to have to add another little post-it for that one. I didn't mark that one yet. So thank you for describing that. That sounds delicious. Okay, so we've talked about the 4 main stories, and I really appreciate the this opportunity, Dan, for our group to study your work some more. This book is another great example of how your influence, your impact internationally and well as nationally with the Blue Zones has changed lives. And I found a quote by yours that I just thought was fantastic. It went really well with the first one and this one. Yes, 10 extra good years, but you said the same behaviors that yield a longer life yield a richer life. So thank you, Dan, for giving us all those things through the book.
Oh, it was really a delight to talk to you. Thank you very much. And I'm honored to be part of the Chat and Chew family. And thank you so much. If anybody has questions for me, they can reach me at Dan Buettner on Instagram. That's Buettner, at Dan Buettner. And I'll answer your questions directly. And the Blue Zones American Kitchens for sale. And you can get it at your local bookstore. That's what we prefer, but also on Amazon. And it makes a great gift for Christmas for anybody you'd like to see live a little longer.
Thank you so much for that information. We'll put that in the show notes too, so they can get in touch with you if they have a question.